What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the podcast. I'm here with my buddy Luke Thurston. He is a sophomore computer science major from Houston, Texas, and he is a heck of a guy. He is here to talk about his stories, some of his experiences with Christ, and they are extremely unique. He is gifted in all sorts of areas, in teaching, in communication, in philosophy, and he's going to share his wisdom with us today. So without further ado, I'm going to pray this episode in, and we will get started. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much again for this time that we get to come and just talk about you. There is no greater joy that I take, Lord, that we take than to just lift your name up. And I pray that that's exactly what happens here this afternoon. I pray that every word we speak would be ordained by you, every tangent, every rabbit hole we travel down in, God, that it would be fruitful, that those who hear this would not only be entertained, but that they would be blessed, and that man, you just could keep us strong and steady in your word, in your presence, and that we could just love each other well, God. In your name we pray. Amen. Bro, it's good to see you, man.
It's good to see you too.
Yeah. How has it been? I know we were talking a little bit earlier, but how's life going, bro?
It's going good.
Yeah.
It's pretty busy. So I'm doing engineering, and that's fun because sometimes it's super hard. Sometimes it's like easy, so it's kind of riding the waves.
Yeah, riding through the waves. Is it coding right now? Are you?
Yes, so I am doing computer engineering, so that's kind of more the hardware side with more of like kind of physics and electricity, and then also computer science, which is coding. So I get to see like both avenues. It's really nice.
It's a braver man than I mean, you know me, classic like liberal arts major over here. I cannot do like a lick of numbers. So that like in of itself is impressive, but it's also impressive, and I just want to get right into it, that you are such a faithful follower of Jesus, such a faithful lover of Jesus, and you especially are able to communicate and rationalize both science and like technology and like all of that with your relationship with God. And you do such a good job of connecting those two things and connecting those two passions that you have. A lot of mathematics, a lot of logic, a lot of philosophy, but also so much Christ and so much God. And I was wondering, just like, the floor is yours. Tell us a little bit about your experience. We can start with like your major and how you feel like that kind of connects to the gospel, but also just expanding out into whatever, the Spirit is leading you to tell us, bro.
Yeah, for sure. So let's kind of start with my major, because when I was in high school, that was the last thing I was thinking about.
Same here, bro.
Everyone was kind of thinking like, there's this huge rush to kind of like get into college and, just kind of know where you're going.
Right.
And I wasn't so much focused on that. I was always trying to be like diligent with my grades and things like that. But at the same time, I was more focused on apologetics.
Yeah.
That was just a passion that I had, an interest in high school. And I really didn't even know it until when I was a freshman. We had an apologetics class that our seniors took.
Okay.
And so some of the seniors were in the gym with me. And I think they kind of introduced the classic, like, could God create a rock too heavy for him to lift?
Right.
Right. And so I just remember, like, just being kind of, like, spurred by
Curious.
that. And kind of asking questions and talking for a little while. And then I know that I would run track also, and one of the seniors there was, like, kind of into apologetics, and so we would talk. And so, just my freshman year, I was just kind of really, like, motivated by that, just kind of like to find out the truth and just kind of understand like the backdrop of what was going on, because it didn't seem like most people would be talking about these types of issues on a regular basis. But more towards my sophomore year, and I guess a little bit in my freshman year, but more towards my sophomore year, it was really it was difficult for me to sort of reconcile these two kind of ideas of like, one, there being this God who made the world, and who apparently like made everything good, and then
the world that's so broken, bro.
Yeah, and just seeing like how there's these just like copious amounts of like things that aren't right, and I think that's like it's a very common struggle for people, but that was something that I was really like going through hard sophomore year. I was like, these two things just don't seem to make sense,
right?
And I remember I went into sophomore year, I went and talked to my high school apologetics teacher.
Okay.
And we went through a couple conversations, but we talked about evil a little bit, and I kind of walked away from those conversations thinking, well, I just need to put all my emotions aside, right, and just kind of like be strictly logical, and just sort of, I don't know, left-brained about this, and so that sort of thinking led me to just kind of examine the arguments for God's existence, right, and just say like,
what were those? Do you remember any specific ones that were catching your mind at that time?
Yeah, so a lot of different arguments for God's existence, and the one that I was thinking about the most was the ontological argument.
Right.
And so this is just the idea that the definition of God, like if you could really understand who God was, you would understand that he exists, right? And so it's this sort of thing. It's like, you're Cody Mack, right?
Yeah.
And, I know you, and you have like a little goatee going on here.
Thanks, buddy.
Right? And you have like, you have eyes, right? Those are your properties, right? But with God, it's like, it's very different with God.
Okay.
It's like if you start thinking about God and you start thinking about his properties, you would have to like come to the conclusion after a while that existence would be one of those properties. So that's the argument, and there's more like fleshing it out. But because I was just kind of like so like motivated by that logical precision, there's a lot of like formalism behind the ontological argument. And so that's why I was just like, well, I know this sort of like problem of evil is like really dense and it's intense, but it seems like the ontological argument, at least in its formal presentation, is valid. Right. And so like I should just kind of like forget about my emotions and just kind of like go through the motions, even if it doesn't make sense. Emotionally, like the logic is telling me where to go. Right.
Do you think it was turning off your personal emotions in that it was specifically relating to evil? Because I think you kind of had to turn off for a second the thought that God was loving. Not like that, but like you had to understand that God's love didn't look like what you thought it was supposed to look like. Because a lot of people, I think that's the main question is like, okay, if God is real and God exists and he is all knowing, all good, all loving, and there's so much sin left in the world, and like who done it? Like why is this? And so I think I'm hearing like when you say like I turned off my emotions, I know that takes a lot deeper meaning for you, but I wonder if the start of that was just kind of like you had to like logically or just like as a thought experiment say like forget what I feel right now. I just have to look at the cold hard facts of like if God is real, then what are his properties? What are his attributes and his facets? Is that in the ballpark-ish? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I guess it would be like you can go into a situation with other people and you can feel a certain way.
Right.
And that can be like totally like out of the ballpark. With how like reality is.
Right.
And so I kind of like
your emotions are deceptive, bro.
Right. It's like, the Bible talks about the heart being deceitful. Right. Now I barely read the Bible in high school.
Right.
Besides like in my Bible classes.
Okay.
But I mean that was kind of like the idea was like, you can't really trust your heart. But with logic, it's sort of like this foundation that like if you know something to be true logically, you're not going to get steered wrong.
Interesting. And you think, and I'll just jump into this right now, you think that logic ultimately comes from the mind, the consciousness, or do you think, and maybe if it does, is that consciousness from God? Is that consciousness kind of made through nature? Is that a natural thing that could have come about naturally? Or is there just so much complexity within the mind that you're thinking, okay, there has to be design behind this?
All right, so I feel like it'd be helpful to kind of like spell out some categories.
Yeah, go for it, bro. I'm all ears.
You are you're a physical object, okay?
Yeah.
And you are
objectify me.
Right. Yeah, no, for sure.
Exactly.
But you are at least partly a physical object, and there are very few people who would disagree with you on that.
Yeah, I've got a material aspect.
You're made up of atoms and things like that. And this table presumably is a physical object, right? Most people who do science think that material used to be a lot more dense in the past than it
Big
is right
Bang
now.
And everything was at once in one spot.
Yeah. So that you can't just keep going back into the past and have material the same form in which it is now. And there's kind of a lot more complexity to that. But basically, this is how physical objects are. When we talk about physical objects, we're talking about molecules and atoms, and in some part energy, right?
Okay.
But that's in fields and things like that. Okay. So that's kind of like one like category of things, physical things.
Physical things, one category. Okay.
Right. What Christians would say is that in addition to you being a physical object, that you also are endowed with a spirit.
Okay.
And that your spirit has a mind, that allows you to think, and it has a heart which allows you to feel.
Okay.
Right.
Which are immaterial.
And these things, they're not physical objects like tables and chairs.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, it's just kind of like, you would never go out into the world, pick up a rock by like a pond and go like, oh, this is joy. Right.
Yeah.
It's like these two things are different categories.
Okay.
Right. And so like when we were talking about God, and we were talking about things like minds and consciousness and things like that,
right.
that's a category that's like altogether different from the physical world.
Okay.
And so I think...
But can still be pursued through logic and rationality, just not material and physical, really empirical science, because in order to study consciousness, I mean, people try to, and they're trying to observe consciousness, I think, in the points where it might have originated, the parts where it kind of separates itself from like unconsciousness or pre-consciousness, but like ultimately it's still unobservable. We have this idea and it's theorized to be here, and we have pretty good evidence that like, yeah, if it's here, this is what it would look like, and it looks like this. So yeah, it's probably there, but like we can't see it, bro.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, the thing about it is like, I would want to say that logic is a process of the mind.
Okay.
Right. And so you'll hear a lot of people kind of throw around these two terms, logic and reason.
Okay.
And there is kind of a slight difference. A lot of times when people are talking about logic, they're talking about something that's very formal, like a set of rules.
Mathematical proofs.
Right, so mathematics.
By the book.
Things like that.
Yeah.
So, if you talk about Pythagorean theorem or something like that, that's a mathematical truth,
okay.
right? But it's not in this category of physical objects.
Right.
Now,
it's still an idea.
It's an idea because we have the idea. But I think what a lot of people would want to say is that while there's this category of like the physical, and there's this category of like the mental with like what we think and the heart of what we feel, sort of like that spirit category, there's probably also a third category.
Ooh.
Right? And so this would be kind of like the Plato's kind of like idea of abstract realm. And so that's
literally
kind of,
ideas.
Yeah. Well, they're not so much ideas,
Forms.
but they're kind of like, imagine like, they're just like physical molecules, right? But they're just, they're in the sense that they're independent from the mind.
Okay.
But they're not physical, which is really kind of a hard idea to get around. Right. So when I said logic was a process of the mind, I believe that. But when you talk to most people and you say, well, what is logic? They're going to say, well, it's a set of abstract rules. Okay. Right, and so this would be kind of like Pythagoras' theorem about
so
triangles.
It's something, is it distinguishing, logic is a process that is internal, and it is something that, is evident within us, but only through us is it created, as opposed to logic as something that is external and kind of maybe supernatural in a way?
I would definitely see that because, I think that, and this is kind of what I mean when I say there's kind of like this, there's people are using terms differently.
Right.
When most people use logic, I don't know if they're talking about what logic is.
Yeah.
So
they just kind of mean science in general, or like math. Science. Yeah. Mathematical thought in general.
Right.
Yeah.
When a layperson uses logic, they're talking about like.
I'm a layperson.
I'm a layperson too. I'm not an academic. Anyways, but. So when someone uses that term, they're more talking about when someone in general uses that term, they're talking about like science or math, okay? But that's not what logic is. When an academic uses it, they're talking about these like laws, these propositional laws. That's not what logic is either, right? I mean, I'm fair. Like at least what I believe is that logic is a process of the mind.
Okay.
And it's very hard to define what logic is.
Right.
But I don't know if when you read like John 1. And it says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Right? That word in Greek is logos.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so people talk about God being the logic, right? Yeah. And so I think that's an interesting idea to explore, but it's really hard to parse what that means.
Do you want to do that right now? You want to dig through John 1, bro?
We can.
Yeah. Were you going somewhere with that? We can always come back to it.
Yeah, it might be a good idea to come back to it.
Okay, we'll come back to it, bro.
Yeah, just because... because I was
Trains
thinking,
of thought.
Yeah, so when I was in high school, so I kind of had this kind of like division between emotions and logic, and I think a lot of people feel that, especially if you're doing more like math and science. But I really wasn't into math and science; I was more into apologetics.
Gotcha.
So there was this huge kind of tension there, and I got through high school, the tension was still there, and I got into college, and I really just kind of like I think freshman year, I was sort of involved in a church. But I wasn't as involved as I should have been.
Okay.
Right. I didn't go every Sunday and stuff like that. And I remember applying for impact counselor.
Yeah.
It wasn't even, I mean,
thank the Lord you did.
Yeah, I wasn't going to do it, and then
really,
and my mom was like, no, you need to apply for this. This is
right.
like a good
Keep
thing.
the door open.
Right. And so I was just like, all right. So I remember just like cramming through an application, and then like I think my browser shut down, so I had to go like do it again. Anyways, so I applied to Impact. And I remember just kind of coming to the meetings with you guys. Mm-hmm. And, I was kind of approaching this from just a logical perspective.
Yeah.
This is what
I saw that right away.
Yeah, and I looked around and I saw people like genuinely having like real experiences in worship in ways that like that I wasn't
be
accustomed
explained or
to.
rationalized. Yeah.
Well, it's not even that they can't be rationalized. It's just that I wasn't used to that.
Right.
I mean, it seemed like that they were just very sincere, and I mean that was just. It's not that I hadn't been around sincere Christians before. But, I just worshiping was not something that I had done with my heart.
Right.
And just to see other people do that was very impactful on me. And I mean, so I guess before I've been thinking that, that just sort of like, you can have like emotions in any religion.
Okay.
But I didn't like cement it to anyone. So like when I saw like the people who were just being so genuine, like that really encouraged me in my relationship with God. And like I really wasn't even reading the Bible, right? Yeah. So I kind of started Bible reading.
Dude,
and
that'll hit you. That'll hit you real quick, boy.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like I didn't even know why I wasn't reading the Bible, because it's just like it's so obvious.
Rich. Yeah,
it's like if you're going to be a Christian, at some point you're going to have to open the book, right? And it's kind of like, well, of course you're not experiencing any emotional connection with God. You haven't like read his word, and you're not listening for his voice.
Yeah.
And just me personally, sort of opening up in that way, that was very helpful.
Well, that's the Logos right there, bro. I mean, it's both the word, and it is like kind of like, as we've semantically, slipped it into everything else. It is logic, and it is reason, but the fundamental aspect is the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and by Him all things were made, and nothing was made that was not made through Him. And so and then that Word became flesh and Jesus and all that cool stuff. But it's like the fact that, and I was in that same boat as you up until my freshman year in college, because I went to Impact Retreat as a freshman, like as a camper, as a retreatant, and I saw the counselors doing quiet time, and I was like, people actually do this? I thought this was something that like pastors did, or like worship leaders did, or people who were like super crazy into the faith were like reading their Bible every day. And I was like, no, we just try to do it, and it's a thing we do. And I was like, okay, cool. And I started reading it, and like my life flipped.
Yes.
And it's strange how quick it flips for you, because the voice starts speaking, and it's like it's been speaking the whole time.
Just haven't been listening,
and you start to recognize when things happen. You're like, oh my gosh, this is how God is here. This is where He looks like He is over here, and like you start to get tuned in with the Spirit. And I'm like, it's amazing how like just it's not just a book, but how words and how words that like we attribute to like divine inspiration like truly have that life-changing like impact on us. And I'm so glad you brought that up, bro, because that's really good.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, the other thing is like it's kind of just kind of like getting on the other side of that after like doing Bible reading, and not that I've stopped Bible reading obviously, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like the whole approach of just kind of like narrowly logically trying to like weave your way into a relationship or a knowledge of God. Like that's not how it works. I mean, like, so there's this distinction between like knowing about God
and knowing
God, right? And I believe it's Spurgeon who kind of like sort of made this, but the thing is like it's actually like it's really, really, really true, right? I mean, you can just know every fact about God, right? Or just like take anyone, right? It's like I could know all the facts about you. I could know like where you were born, like again, like what color your eyes are, what color your hair is, things like that. And it's like that just knowledge of someone
is not relationship.
It's not a relationship with them.
Yeah.
But that's the point of Christianity, right? It's about having a relationship with the mind that's under the universe,
right?
Because He made you for that relationship.
Yeah.
Right. That is the purpose of your life, is to be in a relationship with God.
Yeah.
And if you just sort of like come from this logical perspective without emotions, you're really just you're damaging your experience with God.
Yeah.
So I would really want to like say strongly that like, well, you shouldn't like reject logic. It's very helpful, and like it even
pretty
talks,
helpful.
Right? It even talks about in Proverbs, like before God laid the foundations of the world, like He was putting in wisdom. Yeah. Right. Like that's
wisdom is personified in Scripture over and over again, bro.
Right. It's like she's been there singing, right? Like
she calls out.
Yeah, she calls out in the streets. So like, I mean, this is the foundation, right? You're not going to get into a relationship with God and then things are just not going to be illogical, right? So logic is important,
right?
But just knowledge of like axioms or propositions, right? That is not going to bring you into a relationship with God.
Not a full relationship.
There has to be an opening of your heart.
Yeah.
Right. And that's kind of what relationships are, is sort of opening your heart.
Yeah. And we've talked about this at great length on different occasions before, and we won't like get into that. But like, I love how you put it, is that like you can know about God, and preachers do a really good job of this, especially here. It's like you can know about God, you can know every single, minute point and, Sunday school answer, but until you open the book, until you actually start talking back to Him, that's the relationship. And I feel like that's where prayer comes in really, as sort of this communication, because He's speaking the word to you. And when you speak that word back to Him and you start to acknowledge His presence and you start to communicate and have this discourse with the King of the universe, it's like another door opens. Because, that discussion starts really as you're listening, and there's a part where it's like, okay, I'm actively listening for the voice of God here. But then at some point, again, after opening the book, you got to talk back, because He wants to hear from you. And He is excited to hear from you. And more than anything in the world, He wants to know and to love you. And the way that He does that through so many avenues, but really through just our discussions with Him. I've been blessed countless times over through prayer. And prayer really for me, it's probably the epitome of that emotional experience, because you have the rational side of it. I can go through Scripture and just kind of like, have this theological lens that I'm wearing and being like, okay, here's all the connections and here's where A meets B and C. Yeah. But when I start talking back, is when the tears start rolling. Yeah. And when I just start sobbing and I run out of words to say, because it's like, as much as I think that I know, there's another aspect of God that is so relational, and I think relationship is inherently emotional as well, because because we think about that cold, distant type, this super calculated, super logical, computer machine of a man, and it's just, there's not a happy ending to that story.
You're right.
There really isn't, and I think it takes us a long time. It took me a while, because there was certainly a part in my high school experience where, more out of a like rebellious phase of, I'm not going to care about anything. I'm too cool for school. I'm too cool for people and stuff like that. It's like, I'm going to shut off the emotions. I'm going to do whatever. And I'm going to pretend like nothing hurts me. And you're just going to build that wall up and like let nobody through. But that is so isolating and so detrimental. And I feel like you can empathize with that in like your personal experience and maybe share some of that with us. But it's like, man, we need that relationship with Him, with community around us, both like vertical and horizontal. It's huge, absolutely huge.
Well, and one of the things I would say is this is just purely observational.
Right.
But one of the things I've noticed about other people in general is like there's this huge stereotype that if you just shut off your emotions and you just go through problems at the back of a textbook, you're going to becoming just this math genius or this, this scientific genius, and that's how you get good at science. When I've talked to people like professors and things like that, and I see like the people who are like very cold and distant from the text and things like that, I'm just going to do the problems, or I'm just going to think about the concepts and that's it. Yeah. They're usually the worst at mathematics. They're usually the worst at science.
Okay.
The people who are really good at science and mathematics
are empathetic.
Are the people who love it.
Yeah.
They're engaging their emotions.
Passion.
And there's a very big distinction between engaging your passions with mathematics and science and then letting sort of something like math or science lord over you.
Yeah.
Like there's a very big difference between that, and you have to distance yourself from that because you don't want to make it a god.
Right.
But at the same time, God created you. He gave you desires and passions, and He wants you to use those faithfully in accordance with Him. And just one of the things that I've noticed is that when people disengage their passions and just only use one of the set of faculties that God gives them, they tend to not excel as much as people who are engaging both of those sets of faculties.
Yeah. That's so absolutely true. And I think it kind of goes back to like left brain, right brain stuff that you were hitting on earlier. I know, and this is kind of like prideful English major talking, like the scientists that we know about, the scientists that we think about and like are relevant in popular culture, the Neil deGrasse Tysons, the Michio Kakus, the Carl Sagans of the world, like with whatever ideas that they have, like however religious they are or not, the reason we know about them and the reason science suddenly becomes relevant in our lives is because they are passionate enough to communicate it to the masses and to communicate it well. And so there's not only a passion and an ability to do the logical aspect, but also an empathy for all of humanity, for the public, for the masses to, share that information. And I think that kind of is the mindset we also have with the gospel, where it's like, hey, there are people who can be like super theologically with it, and there's nothing wrong with that, and like super apologetically with it, nothing wrong with that, but just not go out and make disciples. And they're very content to read the book and read the books that go along with it and the commentaries and just have this wealth of knowledge. But if that's not being shared, and if there's just not this desire in you to share that message with people, then it's like, what are you doing? What are you doing, bro? And that's what I love so much about you, because you do, and you're a little bit timid about it, and I know you express a little bit insecurity with just being the rational type, but you do in the right circumstances share that passion for not only Christ, but also mathematics and computer science and philosophy, all these things that you love. You are so good and so effective at sharing and communicating that with people, and I love it to death.
Well, yeah, you saying that made me think of something that, I don't know if you remember this, going to Impact this year, TA said something, he's like, if you're putting all this stuff into you, right, like, and you're not giving back.
It's like a sponge, bro.
Right.
You gotta squeeze it.
Yeah. It's like a wet sponge. You have to wring it out, right? And it's like a wet sponge isn't doing anyone any good, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That was good. No, and I know, I remember this at retreat, and you came up to me and you had the biggest smile on your face, and you told me, it's like, you know what, I was in small group, I was with my guys, and I just kept hearing, feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. And I want you to tell us, or I guess anybody listening, what that means for you, is feed my sheep.
Well, so it's kind of interesting to talk about, because people need to be spoken to and spoken into. They need to be built up.
Yeah.
And there is not enough of that in our culture.
Amen, brother.
I think people get spoken down to on a variety of different occasions and discouraged constantly.
Yeah.
Because that's easy. It is easy to discourage people. It's easy to speak down to them.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to just take a second and say, what does this person need?
Yeah.
Right? Do they need a little bit more explanation? Then give them that. Right? Do they need you to like step back and kind of let them like pursue their passions? Do that too. But I think like so many times when we go into relationships in general, or just like speaking, it's so like focused on us and like how to make us feel good, right? And that's fine, right? I mean, there is nothing with pursuing your passions or anything like that, but I think there's maybe not enough focus on building other people up and looking and seeing what their needs are. Yeah. Right? And so, yeah, that's probably what I was going for there.
Yeah. No, and I just remember it being such, I think, an emotional transformation for you, because I remember, I'll just like share everybody another story. At the very beginning, after selections, and when I first met you and when I first met all the guys, we kind of had this bros hangout at the first staff retreat, like we were doing like a weird, not like a pseudo sleepover kind of thing, where we just like, we would stay up and talk for a little while.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this was the occasion when you were talking about worship, but it's definitely one that hits for me, because like we have so many musical people in our camp, and we could talk about like music and math and how it's all beautiful and stuff like that later. But like everybody was like singing and worshiping and doing this, and I saw you kind of off in the corner, not distant, but like watching, and you had this look in your eye like you were really observing something, and I just kind of saw like, okay, like he might not be into this at the moment, he might not be showing a whole lot of emotion, but he's thinking about this, and he has something else inside of him. And I know after that, getting to talk to you at Chick-fil-A for like that 3-hour intro discussion, and finally kind of opening up the egg and seeing your genuine passion for philosophy and logic, I was just like, this boy has been hiding so much from me. There is so much passion, and it really just took that question to light you up. And I think you do that really well on the opposite end, where with your guys, and any time that you would just practice leading discussion during meetings, you can explain things 1,000 different ways, and you can think about things a million different ways. And the way you approach the gospel in particular, when we asked you to share, the gospel and just practice that, I remember hearing your take on it, how you viewed Christ and how you viewed just the person of Christ. It blew my mind away, because most people they run through it chronologically, and they can run through some bits of the law versus the gospel, the old covenant and the new covenant, and give us a verse or two, Romans 6 or 3:23 maybe, I don't know, but you took it in just this radical different direction that I heard, and I was like, this cannot be fake. This cannot be something that anybody else has put in him besides the Spirit. You know what I'm saying? Because it was so original. And the way that your mind works, I mean, it's rational, but it's also so creative. And you look at things intrinsically from just a kaleidoscope of angles. And you come up with admittedly super heady and complex things that blow my mind away. But it's amazing to watch, because you just have it in you. And then when you share it, bro, people are blessed by it. Do not ever discount that for a second. We are phenomenally blessed every time you open your mouth, bro. And I got to see that finally. It took a little bit to crack open the egg, but it was when it opened, bro, I'm so glad it never closed again. Yeah. It's so cool.
Well, and I think that's in everyone.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly, bro.
Yeah.
And the fact that you can open up other people now, and I've seen you do it kind of at retreat, and just you open me up sometimes.
Really?
And granted, I'm pretty much a fairly open book, but it depends on who's talking to me.
That's true.
Every time you look at me and you just ask me bro, how are you doing? I feel my shell just breaks.
Wow, okay.
And then I don't know how you just ask the question, or the fact that I know you're sincere, or the fact that I know you're so wise and so logical and can
all right,
genuinely help me and think about stuff. But every time you legit ask me how are you, I feel the floodgates got cut
all
open.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and I'm just
wow, okay.
No, it's
well, that's great.
There's something about the way that you just approach people that is inviting.
Okay.
And I'm baffled by it. at least personally, because I'm I feel I am always giving Luke a 30-minute talk about my life. And it's not everyone gets that. Some people do, but it's amazing, bro.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
But I do want to get into scripture a little bit.
Okay, yeah.
Because we promised we were going to get back to John 1.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, let's go. John 1's an interesting passage.
Dude, bro, I love it. That's one of my top favorite chapters in scripture. Is there a place you wanted to start, bro, or do you just want to run through this together? I don't know.
Yeah. Let's go through the first 4 verses.
Okay. Yeah. So, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Dude, that's pretty...
Yeah.
That's pretty deep, bro.
Well, there's a lot of stuff in there that's kind of it's hard to wrestle with.
Right.
And I just kind of, I remember when Jesus talks about God sort of revealing his truth to little children by hiding it from sages, right? It's that kind of brings to mind because
you thought Pharisees.
right. Well, yeah, it's you can just read this and it's just this makes so much sense and how God created the world, but then there's so much more richness to that verse. We were talking about logic in the Word.
Yeah.
And I would just say this idea of logic in general is not well understood. It's very difficult. It's what is logic, right? So it's very hard to parse that. But then we could just kind of walk through even a little bit more. It says in the beginning.
Yeah.
Right. So
what was the beginning, bro?
Right. Yeah. It's kind of so there's been kind of this train of thought through theology. Kind of this sort of debate: is there a beginning to the universe?
Right.
Or is there no beginning?
Okay.
Right. And it seems like what we mean when we say beginning is we're talking about a temporal beginning, right?
Right.
So was there a first moment of time?
Yes.
Yeah. And so I think we could probably maybe explore that for a little bit.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Because cool. Because when I think about I think I wrote something about this because I was like trying to wrestle with it myself, and the fact that God is eternal. Because I mean, you look at Revelation, which John also wrote, because he's just everywhere. You talk about God being the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, but at the same time, he is without beginning and he is without end. So like, I tend to think about like whenever we put God inside of a box and we try to like put boundaries on him, like that's a no-go, you know? But then you think about humanity and the universe and like everything that has been made, you think about that as the box. And I kind of feel like God is like the perimeter of the box, but he's also like just everything outside of it. And like the box has to exist somewhere. Kind
of like a glass in an aquarium. It's like completely full of water, but then water's surrounding it.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's amazing to think about like, okay, like where is the boy? Like where exactly is the beginning, is the end? Because like he is the beginning, he is the end, but he's without beginning and without end. And I'm like, what is that? Like it's such a paradox, but I'm like, it's gotta be true, I think, because he's eternal. And I'm like, bro, what do you think about that?
Well, so I think, one way you could probably go is just sort of like look at the word beginning and say like, well, what does it mean in Greek, or what does it mean in, like in the original language? Okay. So we could do that, and I'm not qualified to do that because I don't know biblical languages, but
I'm Googling that right now.
Well, I would say like it might be more helpful to think about the different types of beginnings philosophically.
Okay.
And so I would think I would say one scholar who's done a lot of like really good work on this would be William Lane Craig.
Can you say that name again?
Sure, William Lane Craig.
William Lane Craig. I'm gonna have to look him up later. That boy.
He's pretty smart on this, and so he sort of ran with the distinction between two schools of Islamic thought.
Right.
There was one called Falsafa, and the other was called Kalam.
Yeah.
Right. And so these kind of schools of Islamic thought had different ideas about the universe's beginning, right? And this sort of stemmed from the sort of debate between Plato and Aristotle,
right?
But the guys on the Falsafa side, they really thought that the universe was eternal, and so that when God was creating the universe, or when we say the universe began to exist, they meant it something like this. Imagine that there's a plane of sand, right, and there's a foot that's on the plane of sand, right? And it's been this way from eternity, right? So we would want to say, hey, look, the beginning of the imprint of this foot in the sand is causally due to the foot, but it's been this way forever, right? So the only sense in which the universe began to exist
is if there's a foot,
right? If there was no foot, there would be no imprint in the sand.
Okay.
So if there was no God, there would be no universe,
right?
So God just sort of causally upholds it, but he doesn't temporally uphold it. Right.
Okay.
And
that's blowing my mind already.
It's kind of this weird.
It's heady, bro. I love it though. Keep going.
The other way would be to say, no, like there's some problems with the idea of an infinite amount of things, right? It's like an infinite amount of time, and because there's like paradoxes with infinity, then you have to have God creating the universe at a beginning point.
Okay.
And so that's sort of a weird thing to think about.
Yeah.
Right. There's maybe some like different layers to that, but
well, because I've also heard it explained just kind of like in terms of like extra dimensions, and like people kind of like theorize a little bit, where it's like if there is a fifth dimension, like we would never be able to observe it, and that's the problem with science right now. Mm-hmm. Or, I mean, I wouldn't call it a problem, but like the conundrum that it's in terms of trying to talk about these theories of extra dimensions and like what, and it's not even like conspiracy anymore. It's like, okay, like we have reason to suspect, like because of the way atoms work and like the way they function and interact, it's like there could be something that we legit can't observe, that there are these fields around us that like just aren't measurable, they aren't observable, they aren't empirical, but they could be there, and what exists within them we could never know through science.
So that is a dimensions is another word that has a very formal definition in mathematics and science, but then it has this sort of like colloquial definition of kind of like, when we think of a dimension, we're talking about like sort of one axis in three-dimensional space.
Gotcha.
Right. And so it's not technically the idea behind a dimension. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit more complex than that, and I don't want to take us like too far off.
We'll see.
But yeah, let's just see if I can explain this. So, like let's just think about the x-axis for a while.
Right.
You could extend that infinitely.
Yeah.
Okay, like, and when I say infinitely, what I mean is there'd never be a point when you're extending the x-axis at which you couldn't go further.
Okay.
Right? So for every extension of the x-axis, you could also extend it further.
Right.
So that's this idea of extending an axis. Okay, in math and science, there's these idea of vectors.
Yeah.
Right? So it's where you take a line and you draw an arrow on the end of it, right?
I remember that in geometry, bro.
That's a vector, right?
Yeah.
So, we have vectors for each axis.
Okay.
So there's like an I hat vector for the x-axis, and then there's a j vector for the y-axis.
Gotcha.
And how many j vectors you go? So let's say I have 4 j hat. Right, you're going up 4 units in the y dimension. If you say 3 I hat, you're going over 3 units in the x axis. So this idea of a dimension is just a scalar, like a number 4 with a vector. Right?
Okay.
That's what it is in mathematics.
It's a distance and a unit of distance.
It's a distance and a scale of that.
Okay.
Right? So if you have an I hat vector and then you extend it 4 times.
So we're really just talking about space and how you quantify space.
Right. We're talking about extensions of these axes.
The pure measurement of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is kind of one of the problems is like if you wanted to go up 3, 4, right? You would just say 3 I hat, 4 j hat. Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's like chess, bro.
Yeah. Right. And so when we work in 3 dimensions, you want to say 3, 4, 5, you just say 3 I hat, 4 j hat, 5 k hat. Mm-hmm. You just add different vectors.
Right.
The problem though is you could keep going on infinitely. You could say 6 p hat or whatever, right? So you could just keep adding more vectors. So you could have infinite dimensions, and that's right.
Oh, okay. In every
but it's just a mathematical formalism, right? It's just taking a scalar and multiplying a type of vector. We understand this when you do 3 of them, but what does it mean to add a 4th one?
It's kind of like, so I know I'm picturing it in my head, and so you have almost like the 3 edges of a cube going to a corner, and so that's what I typically think about when I think of like 3-dimensional space. That's the graph that they draw. And I think what you're getting into is like not like dashed lines, but imagine like you ever play jacks and stuff like that. It's kind of like that, but if you threw like a ton of little lines of the jack, like it was just more of a, gosh, they had balls like this, or like a porcupine. And is that what you're talking about in terms of like each little thing is like a vector, and every way you extend like the quill, it could be another freaking dimension. Is that it?
It kind of.
Okay.
Kind of. And
I'm trying to think like visually what that would look like.
And here's the problem with trying to visualize this stuff is we can only think in 3 dimensions. At least that's what we think we can think. I mean, if someone has a really good analogy for like how we could extend dimensions further than 3,
oh gosh,
right, we're willing to listen.
Right.
But I mean, so some people say, well, yeah, there's really 4 dimensions, and the 4th dimension is time, right? And so it's like you can do that, right?
Yeah.
But it's like, well, what does that mean? Okay.
Right. Well, because most people measure time on one of the axes to begin with, unless they.
Well, so you can draw graphs differently. So you can say you can have a t-axis and a y-axis.
Right. Okay.
Right? So it depends on how you draw your graph.
Got you.
But imagine trying to have.
But it could be all space, and then like you just add whatever like next dimension you add. It could be time. Okay.
Yeah. Sure. But I mean, it would be we can't draw a 4-dimensional graph. Right, because we're so that's kind of the problem.
We're monkeys.
It's like mathematically, well, we're not monkeys, but we can just because you can write down a mathematical operation, does not mean you can understand that operation. And I think that's kind of what's going on with vector spaces. So that kind of idea is like each 4 times I hat, that's a dimension, and then when you add them up, you get a space. So if you had a 3-dimensional space, you'd have 3 of those 4 times I, right?
Yeah.
Does that kind of make sense?
So like area with 2 dimensions, right? And I know volume, you get that 3 dimensions. And so that's just a different way of talking about, again, like quantifying space.
That's a measure, yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so what would the units even look like for adding that 4th dimension?
It would just be like a 4t hat.
Okay.
Yeah, so you're just adding another one. So that's what it is mathematically, right?
Right.
But the problem is that once you sort of like, when you said like a 5th dimension,
it's
like you can always add another vector, right? You can draw it on paper, but you can't understand that.
Yeah.
Right? At least we don't have a good analogy yet for how you can understand that. And so this is kind of like that problem that we run into when we're talking about space.
Can you put it into a computer? Maybe like in program, like even.
Can you program it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So a computer is just going to be working on math and logic that we program into it.
Okay.
So yeah. You can put it into a computer, sure.
Right.
It's just like, at some point, you have to interpret what the computer's saying.
Right, because isn't that like, forgive me if I'm wrong, because isn't it like, if you, like mathematicians, when they try to like fact check themselves or like, or do proofs, they'll like if they'll see if it operationally works into a computer. And if you can operationally make it fit into a computer, because the computer's like not always 1s and 0s. I could be totally wrong on that.
I think what you're talking, so I don't know if you're talking about this, but let me just throw it out there because you might be. So there's this whole like division of logic called proof theory.
Okay.
And so people just kind of think about like what proofs can we make,
right?
And I'm not saying that I have any mastery over proof theory. I'm just kind of telling you what's out there. So
giving a brief outline.
Yeah, right. And so then there's this subfield of, there's this idea in computer science called theorem proving, automated theorem proving. And so they'll just try to get theorems and say, like, can we prove these theorems? So there was this famous philosopher called Bertrand Russell, and he worked with another philosopher called Whitehead. So they made this sort of like Principia Mathematica, where they tried to like take all of like, can we write mathematics in first order logic? Okay. Right? So with just propositions and stuff like that. And they took just so much time to prove different things. Yeah. But when people were kind of in the second half of the 20th century here, when we got automated theorem proving, we just put some of those theorems in and we'd prove tons of pages in minutes. Yeah. Right? And so
it just gets quicker.
Yeah, but all we did was we started with a set of rules, and then we put formulas into that set of rules, and we got a result. That's it. And so that's a very cold, like logical mathematical process, right? But yeah, that's
well, it still takes the human to put them in.
It takes the human to put them in, but at the end, like, can you interpret your result? Right. And so one of the questions is like, are those rules that you started with, are those valid rules?
Coming back to that same point, it's like, are we kind of like too smart for our own good in that way?
No. I just think, it's a valid question to say, like, can we like get to the end of a certain proof? I think another valid question is, are the rules that we're starting with, are those valid also? Yeah. Right. So
the fundamental principles, bro.
Right. Are those like the things that underlie
things that you
logic,
trust? Right. Because if one of those babies is off, what do we know?
Yeah. So like in set theory, there's this axiom of infinity, right, which is kind of sort of like postulates infinite sets. Right, and so that's kind of how we get around it. We never prove that there are infinite sets. We just sort of axiomatize it.
And that's what I definitely want to get into in terms of just science in general, but especially with proofs. And proof is such a loaded word because you talk about proof as like, this is so solid. Okay. But as people are constantly disproving in science, and you actually work to disprove, and you continuously repeat experiments to find the fault in the experiment and see if it can be redone, reevaluated, like in the same manner. And it's interesting sometimes when both science and religion are very guilty of this, where we assume that we have the end of information, and when we start to assume that we know the ending, I was talking a little bit about this with my friend Austin, when we assume that there's like no ambiguity and that we can like have this complete confidence in our own set of rules, whether that's logic, whether that's like math or theology or or religious studies, it's like you miss something. And there's always the possibility even that you miss something, even if you're like, there's no way I missed this. It's like, bro, 10, 20 years, give it time. Somebody's going to think of something. And some things do stand the test of time, but I'm also like, I would never trust myself with anything to say that I know for absolute certain that this is the end of it, that this is the end of science, that this is the end of, which baffles me a little bit, especially when you get into really materialist science, and the kind of general idea that's thrown out there, that as we get better and better and better at science and we can explain more things materially, that the need for God disappears. And I'm just like, well, how do you reach that end point? It literally is infinite in a way, and I would imagine it is. And if it's infinite, then what would make us think that we could ever know it all?
That's kind of one of the things is like, so there's two sort of different ideas here. So there's like the data, right, and then there's like the beliefs that we have about the
interpretation of the data. Okay,
right. And so like if we were going to put this in one of the three categories that I kind of spelled out at the beginning, we might say data is kind of like abstract. Right. Okay. Because it's all these propositions, right? And so you can imagine a proposition for everything about the world. Yeah. Right. But then there's our beliefs, our mental status towards these abstract objects, right? And so
and those beliefs are going to affect how you do the rest of your experiments, not only into the interpretations, but how you make the data.
Well, I think what you're saying is like
the presuppositions. Yeah, well,
it's like there's an infinite amount of data, right? And you could never obtain it all. The only way you could obtain it all is if you're God, right? And so you can't.
Thank you, Jesus.
Yeah. Well, you can't have maximal certainty or just complete understanding. Which
is where faith comes in.
I think in some sense.
Call it belief. Yeah. I think a lot of people... I see faith and belief for me are very synonymous. And I think that like because we're talking about like believing and knowing or believing in like that type of thing. But for me, like faith and belief come very similar, and that's how I talk about them, is very similar things. And so when I think about the fact that there is this amazing wealth of data that's left to be discovered or interpreted and stuff like that, it's like you've got to have faith in something, faith in your ability to interpret that data, faith in your ability to observe that data, or faith in something that is greater than you, that is looking at that in a way that you never could and that you don't have to understand it, which is the case that I usually make in terms of like, there's some stuff that I don't think I was meant to know, or that I don't have to know, because you only got to know Christ. In the end game, the end game. Does he want us to know? Does he want us to grow in knowledge and stature, just like seeing the depths of his creation? Absolutely. But like when we start to think again, like that we could come to an end of it, you know, it's like, where's the joy or the hope in that? I don't know.
Well, and this is another thing that I was remembering that TA said was like, God just doesn't have limits, right? Which means that like
limitless God, baby.
Yeah. Like I mean, like however much knowledge you have about God, there is always more.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and it's not to say that you should want that. There's obviously a big distinction between the Creator and the creature, and you're not supposed to like try to transcend that gap. That's very bad, right? But at the same time,
that's Romans, bro.
Yeah, you need to enjoy Jesus and the knowledge that He gives you, and you need to be faithful with what He gives you. Yeah. So,
going back to, I guess we were talking about dimensions maybe last.
We were talking a little bit about dimensions, but then we got into something else.
Material stuff and maybe belief in time. And
we were talking a little bit about the difference between belief and knowledge. Which is, there's like some valid like parsing of words there.
Right.
I think one thing that's important when we're talking about faith is to understand that so when I believe something, right, I think it's true. Yeah. Okay.
Truth.
It's so fun. Like, faith is sort of like trusting in what we don't see, but having hope about that regardless. Right. And that's sort of weird because we as humans really like to see something. Right. And the Bible talks about walking by faith and not by sight. So it sort of contrasts those two things. So it is sort of one of those tricky things to navigate. It's like, well, you can believe things in one of two ways. You can believe them because you see them, or you can believe them because you trust in a reliable source. Right. And so in this case, we're putting our trust in God.
And you can see that reliable source. Usually.
Usually. Well, I would say like, okay, the amount of faith that we put in God, I would say it would be very irrational to put in anything else, right? Because when God says have faith in me, it's not like asking you to have faith in your dog. It's not like asking you to have faith in your parents. Because even though you might trust that your pets or your parents or your relatives are going to do what you ask them to do
and be faithful
or be faithful to you,
empathetic, and be there when
all
you need
of those
them.
Things, right? As much as you can rely on those things for support, they can't be 100% faithful. There are times where they will leave you, and if you try to lean on them with everything that you have, eventually they're going to break because your relationship with them is not meant to carry the full weight of the desires of your heart, right? It's your relationship with God that's like that. God is that which he's always going to be faithful, and he'll never leave you or forsake you.
That's so good, bro. And I don't think that's even a position that would take a whole lot of theological understanding, but just a whole lot of practical, empirical understanding, and saying that like, hey, the stuff in this world, I mean, like religions and philosophies across time have kind of unanimously agreed this place is temporal. It's entropy, it's falling apart, and people naturally are going to be fading away. We grow old and we die, and it's not like there's any like direct correlation between like, oh, you're getting older, so you're going to be like less faithful or whatever. But like we naturally are pretty selfish, I would say, and not that that's like the root of all of it, but like we're just not dependable, and I think a lot of my personal frustrations come when I overcompensate for somebody's lack of like dependability with my expectations on them. Okay. If that makes sense. So like there was no reason for me to place this amount of trust in somebody or to expect that this thing was going to happen or to expect that this plan was going to go this certain way but I just put so much expectation on them, and I just like really irrationally decided like, I know this limit, I know the limits of this person, this project, whatever, but I don't care. I'm just going to push it. And whenever I do that and like kind of ignore the temporal vanity, I would say, of it all. It's like, that's when I run into trouble.
Yeah.
Because I have these different expectations. I have this expectation of eternity when it comes to friends and relationships, that they're always going to be there. And it's not like they start becoming mean or nasty. Like, sometimes that happens. Sometimes it's just like they move to different seasons, bro.
Right.
And they can't always be there for you physically in the way that they were last semester,
right.
last year, when you were in high school. That God is calling you to different places. Thank the Lord. You're sending each other off into different spheres of influence. But man, it's so tough because you want it to be eternal. We have a longing for something that is eternal. And I think that's a great indicator for me personally, that God has put himself in my heart. And every frustration I see in the world around me is a reflection of the fact that I know something should be eternal. Mm-hmm. I have this expectation, this idea that in a perfect world, in a perfect being, they would always be there.
Yeah.
And he fills that hole
yes.
perfectly.
Yes.
Yes. And I love that you were talking about that.
Yeah.
Bro.
You think it might be time for maybe a little break?
Yeah.
Okay.
For sure.
Right.
Just chilling around.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sweet.
Hey everybody, sorry about that little break there. We both had to go to the bathroom. We were talking up a storm, and we both just get really excited about this, and I think our brains were equally fried, I guess we could say. So we just had to take like a 5-10 minute breather and recap, and we're back, and it's everything's fine. Nothing crazy happened, but yeah, we just need a little breather. We were talking about, this whole discourse of science and faith and reason and rationality, your passion, how everything kind of connects and goes together. And I was curious a little bit more about your personal story, because you hinted at you had this apologetics teacher, and it sounded like there was kind of a discipling relationship a little bit there, that you had these discussions and stuff like that. But I also know, and I'll spoil it for everybody, that you were not always a believer, right? And that this was also kind of a conversion experience for you. And so there's a lot of personal weight that this topic gets from you or brings to you. And so I wanted you to kind of share something about that personal experience with anybody listening.
Okay. So this is kind of where it gets interesting, because, when I was really young, I had cancer, and, when I was in that, it wasn't fun, but I was never really angry at God or anything like that. Because I remember people asking me, well, are you angry at God or stuff? And it's like, well, at that time I really had a firm belief that God existed. I never doubted that for a second. And I thought, okay, God got me through this. If he got me through this, he's the one keeping me alive. And so I'm not saying every second of it was fun, but that didn't shake my faith or anything. Right. Okay. When I was talking about the stuff about the problem of evil, that was where it really kind of got it's okay, I was really sort of weighing in my heart, does God exist or does he not exist? Right. And, for me, I was saying, and I think a lot of people go through this, where it's such a logical thing for them. Right. And so, I was saying, it's just about the arguments, and that's it. Yeah. And when I got to the end of high school, I don't even know, it wasn't so much that I was looking for an argument, which I was look, I see these arguments, they're valid, that doesn't help. Right. And so it was really hard for me to be motivated by Christianity. And it was really hard for me to sort of engage with that whole belief set. And I don't know, so right after I had cancer, I gave my life to Christ, and I got baptized. That's awesome. And I think at that moment was when he grabbed hold of me and saved me. Yeah. And, I just really want to affirm that. So I don't know if there was any one point. There were definitely points in my high school life where it was very difficult for me, and I had doubts. Right. And, there were some days where I just kind of felt like I was the only, the universe was all that there was. But even through those doubts, I don't know if there was ever a point where God let go of me, even though I wanted to let go of God. Right. And that lack of faith, it wasn't good. And it's not something I'm proud about. Yeah. It's not something I would love to share more about.
Okay.
So it's because it was so like, I mean, think about that. Like most people who are atheists today, if you give them an argument, if you give them a logical reason for why God exists, it will do almost nothing.
Right.
Right. If you say, look, the universe had to have a beginning point at the Big Bang, they'll say that's great, but it's not helping my heart.
Yeah.
And so sort of like on the other side of that is like when you go and pursue like other routes besides the logic, it's like you come around on the backside of that just so much more broken. And just when you see it's like, oh wait, God really does exist. Oh wait, he really is like there and he's been watching me the whole time. It's like there are things that don't like that and want to keep you from God.
Right.
And that can be very scary. So like going through that whole conversion process is probably something I'm not fully ready to talk about right now. But I would just say like if you're like pursuing God from a purely logical perspective, stop it, right? Like open up the Bible and read it. And I know like that first like voice that comes into your head is like, oh, well, I could open up the Quran, I could open up all these other things, and you could. But for me, it's really it's really that sort of that personal, that inner subjective experience that sort of like has been cemented in for me that I know that this is true. So that's kind of where I am with that.
And that's
sorry to be a little
huge.
bit vague.
No, that's perfectly fine, bro. And it's always like whatever you're comfortable sharing. But I'm so glad that you did, because it is such a personal experience for you. And that's the only thing I wanted to get out of that question, because I do know you, and I know that really coming into, I think, Impact Retreat, I don't know if it was with us or with your freshman year, learning about yourself in a way, because I think it was with us during the panel discussion time, and we kind of all, go through struggles that we've had, and we raise our hands when we've gone through a similar struggle, whether it's lust, whether it's doubt, whether it's pride and stuff like that. And I think you put doubt on your board, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Yeah, you put doubt on your board,
did.
and you kind of talked about this experience again, a little bit vague, but it's fine. And we all raised our hands. And that surprised you. And I was surprised that surprised you.
Yes.
Because
I felt like it wasn't the same type of doubt. I felt like the doubt was more like one of the other girls said was like, it wasn't so much that I was doubting God's existence as I was doubting his goodness or I was doubting his faithfulness. And it's like, that doubting God's faithfulness or goodness is just as bad as doubting his existence. But for me, it was purely like doubting God's existence. And I don't know if every single one of them was struggling with doubting God's existence. I would be horrified if it was, right?
Yeah.
Because I think most people do sort of accept that it's just sort of intuitive. It's like, how did you get here? Right? Did you do something to bring about your own existence? No. I mean, was there...
It makes enough sense, so why not believe
it?
And
so I think the doubt there is just that God's like so far removed from the situation.
Yeah.
But that's such a lie, though.
Right. See, because he is so personal and he's so good. And I mean, if he was so distant from the situation, then the Christ character is the epitome of an enigma. Because he is literally God, made man. I mean, the Word became flesh, bring it back to Logos.
Right.
And he interceded on our behalf, and he placed himself among us within the brokenness that we are, and he took human form. He took a material self, as well as, the immaterial self that's just like the Trinity and all that. But like, he came into the situation. He is not so far removed. He cried, he wept, he was beaten, he was crucified. Christ had a body. He had a beard. He grew up. Freaking Ricky Bobby over here, giving us some theological wisdom. Or I guess it was his grandfather probably.
Okay.
But whoever played him in the Talladega Nights. But even still, it's like there is so much physical reality to the gospel.
Yes.
And we have the Word as a testament to that. And that Word was not made up for the sake of a good story. That Word is the literal firsthand account so many times of maybe not Christ if you're talking about Paul, but of Christ's acts and Christ's Spirit working through the most crazy situations to bring about joy and peace and healing and resurrection and life, bro. He brings back the dead girl. He brings back Lazarus. He brings back himself. He's bringing back all of us. That's the promise that he made. And it's amazing how so incredibly close he is to the situation. And he is not this cold and distant figure, which is interesting to me, because we've been talking a little bit about this cold, distant rationality. And I think maybe one of the trips in our own minds is, in the words of, I'll forget his name, some postmodern philosopher who was trying to make a point against God, but he was pretty much saying, like, the way you view the world is going to determine the way that you view God. Man makes God as he is, and that type of thing. So if you're a cynic, you're going to see God as cynical. And if you're cold, distant, and rational, you're going to see God as cold, distant, and rational. And so I'm curious if that was something that was going through your mind as well, in terms of like you're distancing yourself from emotion, and then maybe seeing God as somebody who is distant from emotion and distant from that personal experience.
Yeah, the propositions that you see in the Bible where God walks in, where Jesus walks in, and where he heals a little girl, or he casts out a demon, right? Or he does some miraculous thing.
Yeah. That
bothers a lot of people, really, because it's not what they see in their own lives.
Yeah.
It's like those types of experiences, they don't feel like they correspond to their experiences. And so because there's that gap between what they feel and what they read, they kind of feel like, okay, well, if I can't relate to those experiences, well, then maybe I can't relate to God. Does that make sense?
Right.
And that's just not how it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, just because miracles aren't happening every single day in our culture,
or they don't look like the way you want them to,
or they don't look like the way you want them to, or they don't happen when you want them to happen,
and God's timing versus your own.
Yeah, that's a big thing. But it's just that it doesn't mean that those things don't exist, but I think that's what drives a lot of it, right? So like, I feel like if miraculous things were happening, I think
we'd still be just as bamboozled.
Well, no, less people would be atheists, but I don't know if more people would be Christians. Okay? Because they just chase their own things, right?
Right.
They would just be following their own desires.
I mean, Jesus had freeloaders, bro. Jesus had tons of freeloaders.
What do you mean?
Get that fish, get that bread, and then walk off. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean,
crowds don't care.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and there's, yeah, I agree with that.
No, and it's interesting. We're talking about miracles, and how they're strangely so observable, but you can see and not yet understand, you can hear and not yet know, or not yet believe, and that type of thing. It's strange how much empirical science, like we're going back to like this whole, can you see it, can you observe it, and stuff like that.
Can you put it in a lab and test it?
And is it repeatable in a lab? Can you test it repeatedly? And it's like, I would have loved to just like get Jesus in the room today, because he would blow scientists away.
Oh yeah,
he would, and there are things that he could do, and the power that just like goes off of his robe and like heals that one girl who was like bleeding for like 12 years or something like that. It's like, it might be like a sin, and it might be like a root of doubt in my mind, but it's really curiosity. Like I would have loved to just like see Jesus like blow up a lab. not like blow it up like hurt anybody, but just like destroy all the instruments, break all the meters. It's like his power level is over 9,000. That was a weird geek out. I'm sorry, everybody.
No,
but like, it's strange how like we would see it.
Okay.
But like, we would never freaking believe it.
Well, and I think there's a very good reason why Jesus came when he did, right? I mean, I think the scriptures talk about God coming in the fullness of time.
Kairos, in the fullness of time.
Right, the fullness of time, God came, right? I think today's culture, like, he walked into a culture where miraculous things were happening. Yeah. It's not to say that miraculous things don't happen today and now, right?
They look different.
Right, but he was able, the air of the culture today is sort of that miraculous things don't happen. That's kind of like what most people believe. They don't believe in miraculous events. Okay?
Yeah.
If you went back to where Jesus was living, I think most people,
right,
that wouldn't be irrational for them to talk about miracles.
Yeah.
Even though they didn't happen frequently, they at least thought they happened. And Jesus walked into that culture and said, "Oh, you have little faith." Right? It's like, I can't even imagine what he would say to people today.
Oh, that's so big, bro.
I mean, it's like the scientists today, because they're leaning so much on their own wisdom. And it's not to say that they don't know true propositions.
Right.
Then sure,
they can't find truth and that we can't,
Right. But I mean, I just think that, even the thing about science is that, especially when people start saying, well, it contradicts God, it's like, the reason we have science is because of God.
Right.
This is supposed to be an arrow like pointing at him.
Well, historically, you're absolutely right, because I don't know how familiar you are with the history, and I'm, nominally familiar with it.
Okay.
But like the original reason for empirical science was so monks had something to do in their free time.
Really?
Yeah, or people who, there's a lot of like botany, like early biology, like plant studies, and like studying God's creation literally, and trying to like reverse engineer it and see like, I don't think Darwin's a great example, but botany definitely comes to mind in terms of, like, they would just like, monks would have these gardens and these flowers and like all these breeding experiments and stuff like that, like the dominant and the recessive genes, seeing how like God could move and act. Alchemy, I think, was a thing for a while, but it was like, again, these like empirical scientific methods came about from people who were trying to observe not only the universe, but God within the universe, and God through the universe. And I was like, bro, like that is such a different mindset than we have now. And it's really become polarized in the exact opposite direction. It's like there are, not all scientists, I'm not going to ever generalize that because I know a bunch of Christian scientists, not their religion, but like, yeah, people who pursue God and still have that thing. But like so many people are trying to look at science as a way to disprove God's existence and to say there's no way God is here. And I'm like, man, Because Scripture says like what the devil intended for evil, God used for good.
Sure.
But it definitely works the other way around too, where it's like what God intended for good, bro, the devil grabs it, twists it, and perverts it, and turns it into something that's freaking, I hate to say satanic, like science isn't satanic, but
obviously.
Like, right, but it's like, it just takes all the joy from it.
Well,
all the hope from it.
Well, here's the thing, here's kind of what I'm thinking about is like, science is not the creator, it is creation. And it just boggles my mind that people could say, well, we have this creation here, and obviously they don't view it as creation, disproving a creator, right? Yeah. It's kind of like this thing is dependent, right? And if you talk to anyone, even, right, the people who do science the most, who are the most well-educated on science, they know this. They know that science, at least in what we think of what science is, the word literally means knowledge, right?
Okay.
But
Ciencias. It might be Latin, I think, yeah.
Yeah, but it literally means knowledge. So, so this is what we think we know about the universe. The problem is that when we have scientific theories and we talk about, well, we've created this scientific theory, its purpose is not to prove or disprove something.
Okay.
That's not what it's supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be explaining data, right?
Right.
God's not data. He's not an abstract object. He is.
He doesn't fit in our theories, bro.
He just is, right? So this is kind of, there's this doctrine in theology called simplicity, and I don't know if you've heard of it. They just say that, when God says stuff like he says, I am that I am, it's like we could never understand that, right? But he just says
just
it because
pure being,
right? He's just pure being, and it's this idea of like when I say my name is Luke and I'm 16 years old, right? It's like God just is, right? And so that's really hard to understand, and we can't really wrap our minds around this. But the idea is that if you're trying to take a theory, right? So abstract objects, a theory that explains physical molecules, and then disprove a mind, like that's just, it's so obscure that we look at the purpose of science and then what you're trying to fit it to do. It's like those two things are radically different. It's like the purpose of science is to take abstract objects like laws and use them to explain data. That's it.
Yeah.
Okay? And so then we mold these abstract objects based on what we observe. Right? And it just seems crazy to sort of use that, something to talk about a physical object, to disprove something that's not physical.
Right.
And
I see, because I watch a lot of stand-up comedy, and I see comedians and like, satirical guys, they play around with religion all the time because it's a pretty easy target. Between miracles and the Bible's pretty messed up in a lot of parts. And I think they do this playfully, where either they'll look at the virgin birth, or they'll look at, the flood or creation or like Sodom and Gomorrah, and they'll satirize it and stuff like that. But like people respond to those like satires as if they're valid logical arguments against the existence of God. And like, I don't want to like throw that on anybody else's like head or mind, or like pretend like I'm a mind reader, but it's strange. Meme culture gets me all the time. Like whether that's political, whether that's like philosophical, like we'll make like a satirical comment about a thing and then assume that because we can now make fun of it, or like that this thing doesn't make sense to us, that it can't be real.
Well, when you laugh, you're more susceptible to believe something. You're more relaxed.
Really?
Yeah.
I believe that.
That's why comedy is so effective, and that's why when it's done wrong, it can have bad effects. But that's like anything,
right? Well, and I think there is genuinely like a playful spirit, and I love comedy. I love comedians, and I think most of them aren't like super antagonistic. But again, just like it's a pretty easy target, or at least like just like the faith throughout history, we've done some pretty awful things, and it's like clear hypocrisy, and hypocrisy in of itself is irony. The conflict of expectation, and that's what the rhetoric of comedy thrives on, is that irony.
Okay.
Yeah, so like I see that. I'm a little bit frustrated with it, but I laugh along because I know how playfully ignorant it gets.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's...
So I think you're saying it's kind of gotten out of hand, at least in some sense. I mean, you have to be... I know exactly what you're talking about, and I think just people in general, we have to be very careful about taking something that means just so much,
right?
And it's imbued with so much emotion, so much life, and then pointing fingers and laughing at that. Right. And I mean, it works the same with anything, but even with like relationships with other people, right? Like, what is the target of most comedy? It's usually like sexual and relationships, right? And if you do that long enough, and your views about relationships come down to comedy, then you're not going to be able to have deep relationships with everything because it's just a joke to you, and that's not what relationships are. They're not jokes.
Yeah, and I think I've done it. I'm guilty of this before. Like, I'm guilty of I play devil's advocate all the time in terms of like even intellectual conversation, because I love just like exploring. I feel like that's the best way to explore different ideas, is to just go to the opposite extreme and see what happens. Respectfully, of course. But I feel like there's just this definite culture of like trolling and memeing, and it's when that spirit of comedy turns into a worldview shaping mechanism, and it's a strange phenomena to me, because I think rationally most people would be like, here's all the proofs, and here's the arguments, and here's what we can look at, and certainly like God is still not easily observable or not easily measured. He's limitless, but it's like, I don't know exactly where I was going with that, but like we substitute comedy and satire and this rhetoric of, oh, God's just kind of ridiculous, which the concept of religion is in a way, but like it doesn't mean that it's in of itself not true. That's not a valid disproof of God, that he's loving, that he's good. It's a comment and it's food for thought, but like you haven't sat down with the computer or run numbers. There's no standard, there's no method, there's no practice, there's no peer review there. It's just laughter.
Okay, this is actually something that's really important, because I think what happens a lot of times in culture is people will hear something on a podcast or a comedy special, and it's attack on religion, right? It's an emotional attack on religion. And the basis of it is, and it manifests itself in different ways, to say, hey, isn't religion silly? And they sort of lure you in with the emotional hook, right? And it's like, wait a second, that is true. Like, religion does seem silly in this way. And then, like kind of what you were saying, the response to that is like, but you haven't looked at the logic behind it, right? There's actually a good set of like logical foundations. And I would just want to say that maybe that's the wrong approach. Is like, maybe like when we have emotional problems like that, we should struggle for a little bit. And we shouldn't just run to logic. We should, when I say run to logic, I mean, you need to apply logic to the problem. Right. But you also need to say, hey, look, this is an emotional problem.
Recognize your own emotion in dealing with the problem.
Right, and not just run to an argument, right? Because the argument's not going to help you, right? So like if we write out a proof in logic, that's not going to deal with your emotions, regardless of whether it's true or not. Yeah. The problem was really what it is it's an attack, right? It's an emotional attack. And if you don't like mount a defense emotionally, then you're still open, even if you have a really good proof for God's existence, right? So this is why I'm saying you need to engage those emotions, and you need to deal with that. And I think that's so hard for people to do, because they're like, well, where do I run? Right? Yeah. Where do I run? Yeah. And it's like, it's like assuming that your first state was that you believed in God, and then you sort of had this emotional attack. It's like, okay, well, if I believed in God first, then clearly that emotional attack wasn't from him. Clearly, if I have emotions, then God made those and he gave them to me. And then you pray and you ask God to shape those emotions. Yeah. Right? And that's not fun to do, because it takes a while. Yeah. God knows that it's hard for us to wait. It's like you can laugh in an instant, but it takes...
It's a pure physiological response.
It's right there.
It happens quicker than you can understand it.
You don't have to wait for sin to come to your doorstep, but you have to wait on God, and that's what's so difficult.
Yeah, that was a lot, and I'm trying to like even think and process through it now because it's so true, and that you kind of talk about the dichotomy between reason and emotion, and that's what we've been talking about this whole time we've been here. And we talked about for a while how difficult it is to rest on logic alone. Mm-hmm. The opposite is also true, because the heart is deceptive, which we touched on earlier. And the fact that for me personally, I'm not so much of a heady guy. Always, I'm much more of a feeling, experience, personal experience. God has brought me from point A to point B. That to me is observable in my mind, like historical observation and whatnot. But when things do get emotional, and when I let my emotions guide my thinking and my response to people, especially people who maybe not agree with me in terms of like who God is and what we should be, how we should act, and how we should love him in return, it's like I'll get myself into trouble, and I'll end up thinking for hours on end and almost kind of sulking in a weird way, trying to rationalize my own faith to myself and like defend my beliefs to me, when nobody else is around, when nobody else is in the room. I'm not talking through it with anybody, but like I feel like there's this inner struggle, really, and I think that is what doubt is. That inner struggle. It's a lack of
trust.
It's a lack of trust, and I start to really like think, because the emotion can pull you so much deeper. Mm-hmm. We talked about how like it can pull you deeper in a positive or a negative direction, and logic kind of like attempts to distance you from like that negative direction, but there's no up. There's no happy, there's no sad, there's just a neutral, and so you sacrifice the down for no up. But like with emotion, it's like you enjoy all of the up and all of the down, and it's navigating the downsides, and learning how to really just have faith when things are going south. Mm-hmm. Is the best way that I can put it. When you are sitting in your room trying to think through like, God, are you loving? Are you good? Are you here? Mm-hmm. Do you hear me? Do you care about me? If you do, then why did this happen? And those are perfectly reasonable questions to ask. And I think I've heard sermons done poorly and well in terms of like whether or not that question in of itself was a lack of faith, and whether or not those questions should be encouraged. The best preachers, I think, are the ones who always encourage questioning, and who let those questions spur their faith on forward. Because if you go through those doubts with community, and with the word and with prayer, and continuous prayer and community, because man, a lot of my questions don't get answered in an hour or overnight. It's like weeks or months, or in sometimes like even years of just like, God, like I need to know who you are, and I need to know that I can trust you with this. And it's crazy how good, how up and down those emotions really are. But they're so necessary, as we were talking about.
Well, sometimes it's helpful to bring up specific instances, like you brought up the virgin birth. Mm-hmm. So we might bring that up,
right?
And we could talk about that for a little bit. But I think even before we do something like that, it's just to make a distinction between, there is a difference between manifestations and sources of doubt and doubt itself.
Okay.
And what you're struggling with is doubt.
Right.
You are not struggling with the manifestation of doubt.
Okay.
So the manifestation of doubt is like, well, I just don't understand how the virgin birth could really happen.
Yeah.
Well, let's say that I gave you a scientific explanation of how virgins could bear children.
Right.
Okay. Great. So you believe that. You've taken care of that manifestation of doubt. Mm-hmm. But my opinion is you still have the doubt there. That when people like make jokes about religion, what they're really doing is just triggering doubt. They're triggering the emotion.
Right. You have this mindset that's kind of buried within you, I guess that you're saying?
Right, but that itself, the mindset, is what you've got to take care of.
Right.
Right, and Jesus kind of talks about this as like, when he talks about not doubting, he's like, a man who doubts is like a man who's like on the waves, tossed back and forth on the ocean. I mean, think about when you doubt something. You just go back and forth.
Yeah.
And the reason you go back and forth is because you won't get to an answer. And it's really hard. It talks about in Deuteronomy about there's the secret things, and those are God's.
Right.
And there's the revealed things, and those are ours. And I think so many times we're like, well, I just need to know these things, and then I can believe in God.
Yeah.
And God's like, you don't get to decide the process.
Yeah,
First, believe
so
in me, and then all these things.
Right? Things. That's absolutely so true.
And that's so difficult. But no one wants to do that, right? We want these things now. We want the immediate gratification.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of what's happening with the comedy. And
yeah, and comedy was really just kind of like a specific instance of that where I'd seen it. But like as you're talking about the instances versus the mindset.
Well, let's take professors for example.
Okay.
Like professors aren't listening to comedy. Like if you talk about atheistic professors, it's not because they've watched a comedy special. Right. It's literally because they've lived their life and they've seen the world behave in a certain way, and they've never experienced something that's contrary to that.
Committed atheist, as opposed to just kind of like.
It's not a joke for them. Like it's real. And I mean, their experiences don't align with what God's sort of talking about. So.
And you talked about Deuteronomy, which I loved, and the hidden things and the revealed things. And I think the biggest joy for me, like looking at the New Testament, is just like the fact that we now have the manifold wisdom of God in the person of Jesus Christ, and that so much of his character that was hidden or that was prophesied and that was like kind of determined by like, the Jewish people and the people of Israel, like he is a loving God and he is a faithful God, and he's done these signs in Egypt or with the judges or with David and Saul and like those guys, that they still had not seen God in the flesh. They had the whole bit of the Old Testament, like why they had like the veil in the temple, was like you couldn't look at God because you would just die on the spot, like Indiana Jones, like Raiders of the Lost Ark, die on the spot type of thing. And like the fact that he literally came down so we could see him. And Acts 4:20 is one of my favorite verses in the world, not just because it has 4:20 in it, but because it says we cannot help but talk about what we've seen and heard. And it talks about how, I think it's Peter and maybe John who are preaching, about the gospel, and how everyone witnessing them says these are unlearned bros, they are fishermen, but because of the authority with which they speak, they know that they have seen and heard and had this personal experience with Christ. And that just always comes back to me in terms of like, how great is it that God revealed himself so personally? Yeah. And like the fact that and personally is truly a great word for it. And I think the word for it, because it's like the person of Jesus Christ. He was a man. He had a beard. He walked this earth. He performed miracles that they saw and heard and recorded. He preached truth. He preached love. He rebuked, evil, right? He cast out demons. He did so much good, and he was so much more than like just a good teacher. He went and died the death that we deserve, bro. Like of all the stuff that he did, his death has got to be preeminent, and his resurrection even more so, because it's like you now have the perfect example of everything the Old Testament was talking about and prophesying. It's like God will save his people. He will not abandon them. He loves them forever. And Christ's resurrection is that statement fulfilled. It's just like it's no reason for doubt anymore, because we have seen with our eyes just the manifold or manifested love of God. And it's like, it blows my mind, bro.
Oh yeah.
It blows my mind. And even as it blows my mind, I still question it.
I feel that.
Yeah.
I feel that. I mean, I think here's two things that I see. It's like, when you look at other world's religions and stuff like that, it's like people are having these experiences, and it's like, okay, it's like we need to recognize there is a spiritual element, but at the same time, all the books and all the other things where people talk about religions, you get people who are prophets, right? And Jesus wasn't a prophet. He prophesied about the future. He just said these things are going to happen, but he claimed to be God, and that's just incredible. And Christianity has spread like wildfire, and I think that's awesome. And I know that there's like natural processes to that part. Yeah. But and that's if you don't believe, you're obviously going to look more at those natural processes than the spiritual side. Right. But at the same time, so there's another element where you can just be sort of reading through the Bible, and sometimes you just kind of get hit with just like this sort of like
nugget,
right, this nugget that's kind of like dissipates some of the doubt. So I remember, I was reading through a little bit of the Old Testament, and some of it's very dense and very hard, and it's kind of like, okay, like maybe like every single second, it isn't like it isn't connecting with you. It's there's a lot of laws in Deuteronomy and things like that.
Yeah.
And so maybe sometimes those aren't like in your culture.
Yeah.
But I mean, I remember reading one time, and it said in the text, it was like, okay, so the Lord was saying to Moses, like, when has a god, like an idol, like any other thing, reached into a nation and taken an entire people group out? It's just like, whoa. Yeah, you're right. It's like all these other gods. It's like, small miracles, yes. But when has a god ever like reached into a nation and said, no, you're mine, right? Like the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And so like he was like, Israelites are going to come worship me, and he brought them out, right, with an outstretched arm. So
that's so big. And I think about especially with Israel and Egypt, how when Moses is going in and he's doing all the signs for the people, and the people believed, and they're like super faithful, and they've got these like waves of faithfulness and doubt. But I always love the bit where Pharaoh's magicians kind of start doing the tricks that Moses does.
Yeah.
But there comes a point when the magicians even kind of realize, this guy knows more than we do, or there is something else behind this guy. This is literally the finger of God, they say. And Pharaoh's still just like, nah.
Yeah.
And it's his heart was hardened and all that stuff too.
Because the text talks about Moses, like he was angry. And I'm sure like all of us would be angry as well.
Right.
But God was kind of like, no, like I'm hardening his heart. Like that's why. So yeah. But yeah.
It's crazy. Yeah, definitely. Time to just about wrap it up here. But I mean, it's been so good to have you on. I love this discussion. I love talking about, just the marriage between reason and emotion and Christ and the gospel, your personal experience, mine, and just like, hopefully this is a blessing to everybody. You want to pray us out, bud?
Absolutely. All right. Oh dear God, Lord, thank you for this time that you've given us. Thank you for just being real and present in my life and Cody's life. I pray that you would just use this and you would use our actions to be glorifying to you and to honoring to you and to reach more people for your kingdom and your glory. And it's your name I pray and ask these things. Amen.
Amen. Thanks so much, bro.